Welcome to the final episode of the Wheel of Time Diaries. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today I'm going to summarize some of my thoughts on the final trilogy, so to speak, of the Wheel of Time, Brandon Sanderson's output of the series, The Gathering Storm, Towers of Midnight, A Memory of Light, and a little bit of bonus material that I also covered in last diary, episode 74 of the series, extra material that is outside of the main series. You know, the bonus prologue that exists for Eye of the World that isn't in the edition that I read 3 years ago, the Strike at Shale Ghoul, and a couple bits of cut content from A Memory of Light as well. So between all of these things, we're wrapping up the series. We're wrapping up the Wheel of Time Diaries. We're wrapping up the Wheel of Time, not entire on the channel. I will still have more stuff to cover within the series, but I will probably talk about that a little bit at the end of the video. For now, let's just basically summarize what my experience was from a more quantitative perspective. My time spent reading the Wheel of Time for this final trilogy was about 91 and a half hours for these last 3 books, so nigh 100 hours, compared to, or rather, I suppose I should say, I also read an extra 4.5 hours for some of the bonus material that I just referenced, which put my total for this last leg of the series at 96 hours. Compare that to 86 hours for the first 3 books, 137 hours for the next 3 books plus New Spring, and 147 hours plus for books 7 through 11, which puts my total time for everything prior to this year, everything prior to this last leg of the series, 370 hours for the first 11 books plus New Spring, and turned that into 466 hours and 15 minutes, near exactly at the end of the day. Like what I should have done the math on this before I actually got to recording the video, but let's do that real quick. 466.25 divided by 24 hours is 19 and a half days worth of time, which, you know, multiplied by 2, if we assumed if somebody were to read at my reading pace this series for 12 hours every single day, it would take them 39 days to do so. 39 days being, what is that divided by weeks? That's like 5.5 weeks. That is so much time to spend with a single series. But after 3 years, I have finally done it. That is about how much time I have spent. It has been, that's absolutely nuts, actually. Let's talk a little bit now about my ratings of these last books. And it's actually pretty simple this time around, you know? I would say my rating for The Gathering Storm was pretty solid, 5 out of 5. It was the first book in the series that I gave 5 out of 5 to since Fires of Heaven, mind you. I gave 4 out of 5 to Towers of Midnight, and I gave 5 out of 5 again to A Memory of Light, which, you know, there's some ways in which in retrospect I could maybe see myself downing that to 4.5 out of 5 instead of 5 out of 5, but we'll just stick with 5 out of 5 for simplicity. That puts my average rating for this final trilogy of the series at 4.7. And my average rating for the series entire at 4.2 out of 5. So if there's anybody who goes around there trying to tell you that old KC hates the Wheel of Time or hates certain books of the Wheel of Time, most of the time they're like exaggerating at best. I have a list of my ratings for the entire series, which I guess I can go through here for effect, but they're explained a little bit in the last one of these roundup videos that I did. I did a video where I talked about does the slog of the Wheel of Time actually exist? That was when I covered books 7 through 11 of the series, and I go into a little bit more detail regarding my ratings there. My average rating for the first 5 books is pretty high, all things considered, because I gave 5 out of 5 to like 3 of those 6 books, basically, and 4.5 to 2 more of them, and then 4 to the other 2. So, like, that was a pretty high average rating for those. My average for books 7 through 11 is a good bit lower than that, hence how the average for everything leading up to this final leg being 4.1. But now with this final leg included, that is re-upped to 4.2. So that's pretty solid. Like 4 out of 5 for Wheel of Time basically sounds about right to me, with the, whether that leans closer to 4.5 or closer to 3.5, like where in that range it actually falls, being a little bit more dependent on certain elements of preference. And just because I can, I will also say that for the bonus material that I also read, I would give earlier Ravens, the extra prologue to Eye of the World, I gave that like 3 out of 5. I gave The Strike at Sheol Gul 3.5 out of 5. I gave River of Souls 5 out of 5, and I gave A Fire Within the Waves 4.5 out of 5. I did not include those ratings within my averages here because they're so short and insubstantial for the most part that it kind of feels unfair to do so. And they're kind of outside, and one of those things isn't even canon in the first place, so like I just didn't include those in the average ratings. But for all intents and purposes, 4.2 out of 5 for the Wheel of Time. That's pretty good, and should go to show that I don't hate the series at all, even though I complain about a lot of things a lot. But let's go ahead and move on to like the individual entries. What are basically my summarized thoughts, as summarized and condensed as I can possibly put them for the purposes of this video, on each of the books and the bonus material, and then we'll wrap the whole thing up with my overall thoughts on this arc of the series. Basically, what it comes down to is The Gathering Storm being 5 out of 5 was fantastic. I thought that the book basically, as condensed as possible, this is going to be difficult, but I'll do my best. I think that it cleanly opens up a new chapter of the series after the previous 5 books took way too long to do what it was doing. I think that The Gathering Storm opens up a new chapter, a new arc, a new act of the series very effectively, actually looking towards the end in a way that you can actively feel while you're reading the book. Basically all of the former arcs are closed off in this book. There are only a couple that are left hanging loose after Knife of Dreams. Those are cleaned up a bit, excepting one of them, which, it happens in this book, like I kind of suggested, but the general baggage that came with the previous 5 books, whether you want to call it the slog or not, there's definitely baggage that came from those 5 books. It's inherently behind us with The Gathering Storm. The general plot momentum increases and the character development does as well. Overall, it just feels much more like a Wheel of Time book than the last few Wheel of Time books did, because they felt more like what the series started out as. And in my opinion, what the series started out as is a little bit closer to what I think the series identity should have been all along, as opposed to what it ended up being under Robert Jordan's tenure, but that's a completely different discussion to have. All of the major storylines within The Gathering Storm get absolutely massive payoffs, so in and of itself, it as a book is very satisfying and enjoyable. All of the other plot lines are set up well enough where you know that they're going to pick up in the next book. You can kind of tell a lot of what the next book is basically going to do as a result of what this does and does not do in its own way. That is very cool. I do think that Perrin might have done well to feature a little bit more in The Gathering Storm for the structure of the next book, but overall you get a lot of good material within The Gathering Storm. And probably the most impressive thing about The Gathering Storm that Brandon Sanderson does not actually replicate in the other 2 books is that Gathering Storm feels very Robert Jordan in a lot of ways, despite the ways that the pacing has been up, despite the way that certain things have been injected into the book to up the ante a little bit compared to the last handful to make the stakes feel a little bit better. There's a lot about what Sanderson does that had made The Gathering Storm feel very much like Jordan. He emulates that style. He emulates almost all of the characters to a very, very good degree. And even though the chapter and POV allocation isn't super reminiscent of anything Jordan's done in the series, it is in fact very different, it still somehow manages to feel faithful to that in a way that is like hard to explain, but it just felt like I was reading a Robert Jordan book, even though I wasn't, and even though I could tell that it wasn't that way, There's also a little bit of what Jordan hints at with theming throughout the series. He actually brings some of that out in the forefront. Sanderson brings some of that to the forefront in The Gathering Storm. So in a lot of those ways, it manages to be a very effective opener to this last act of the series. Towers of Midnight is a little bit messier, and in fact, I would argue that it's a lot messier than the formal because of many structural decisions that were made within it, most notably related to Perrin's timeline. I think that the timing of his material definitely could have been dealt with a lot better, not just in the way of like, oh, it was forced upon him because of the way that certain plot lines had to be split, because these two books were written as one and then split after the fact. I still think that there were some things about how Perrin's material was actually organized in this version of Towers of Midnight that was not up to what it could have been. I think you could have actually reorganized some of that and had it been more effective. And, kind of as I hinted at with Gathering Storm, I think that some of that material is also a little bit more retroactive. There's a little bit of The Gathering Storm that could have featured some of those scenes or some of those types of scenes from Perrin's POV that would not have bloated The Gathering Storm anymore, would not have lost its own focus anymore, and would have allowed for Towers of Midnight to also allow for certain structural decisions to be more effective within it as well. Also, structurally speaking, Towers of Midnight gets a little bit more frenetic with its POV switches overall compared to The Gathering Storm, and I don't think that it's always very necessary. In fact, I think that it's kind of unjustified in some ways. It just feels less focused than The Gathering Storm does, and I don't think that that was a byproduct of any of the plotting or anything like that. It was just the way that a lot of scenes or a lot of chapters featured multiple POVs where they just kind of didn't need to, where you could have just had a chapter that was one POV and took like the two scenes that are split here and here and put them together, and then these two could have been put together here and it would have been better for that. So there's just certain structural things that make Towers of Midnight inherently weaker, in my opinion, than The Gathering Storm, but the material itself is still really solid. I think it is on the whole very good. You manage to catch up all of the stories. The storylines all catch up with one another eventually, even if there's some timeline stuff with Perrin that is very off. You do get them all to the same place by the end of the book, and at the same time, you start to actually lay down the groundwork for the last battle. Like some of the last battles actively like beginning to happen at the end of Towers of Midnight, and after several books of like promising that the last battle was right immediately upon us and nothing really happening to like prove it, or nothing feeling so urgent as to prove it to the reader that that is something that is imminent. Towers of Midnight and Gathering Storm, both of them together, actually managed to make that feel like an imminent threat, like this is actually happening right now type of thing. And that is something that Towers of Midnight manages to close off on very well. And, kind of pairing that off as well with the aftermath of The Gathering Storm with a couple of its major POVs, which continue in Towers of Midnight leading up to Midnight or Memory of Light, it's important stuff for the last battle that I think is handled really effectively overall. Furthermore, Towers of Midnight also does a heck of a lot of good paying off certain promises over many books of the series. I guess this is sort of something that I've like kind of implied or hinted at a little bit throughout this video. You have things like what Matt's doing for the last handful of books. Some of that material is actually coming to fruition. Perrin finally gets some solid moments to shine for once, alongside some forward momentum for his actual character. He actually has an arc within this book, whereas previously he had not really had basically any effective arc since like book 4 prior. So like it took a long time for Perrin to get where he was going, but he finally got somewhere in this book. And even the White Tower gets to pay off a little bit of a loose end that it featured following the climax of The Gathering Storm, because White Tower had a great storyline in Gathering Storm. Towers of Midnight got to like further compound upon that in a political intrigue kind of way, and I think that worked very well. Moving into A Memory of Light, my general thoughts on this are that it is basically a brilliant close to everything that the series is at this point in time and what it wanted to be overall. You know, the entire book acts as a climax to the series, and it is great for those reasons, but it is also great because it maintains its own structure. You know, it manages to have its own 3-act structure, basically, and it goes through all of that material in its own self-contained way, but pays off some of these subtle thematic ideas that Robert Jordan never really truly injected into the series. Like I said, Gathering Storm kind of brings some of that to the forefront. Memory of Light brings it even more to the forefront and pays all of that stuff off in better ways. You get major satisfying wrap-ups to all of the major plot lines and characters, in my opinion, and also basically all of the villains in a way that I think totally works. There are a couple very minor hangups I have in a couple particular spots on that, but not really worth talking about or noting. Overall, they're so minor compared to the entire 350,000 word book that it's like, I'm not going to complain about that because everything else is handled so well, type of thing. Speaking of things being handled so well, it's a matter of A Memory of Light being impressive because Brandon Sanderson manages to handle so many different things at once. You know, there's a very slight problem, quote unquote, that I have with the chapter delineation of A Memory of Light, and that is that it feels pretty useless when every chapter has like minimum 2, but usually like 3 or 4 different POVs going on in it. The fact that they are split into chapters is arbitrary at best 99% of the time, and the chapter titles only having to do with like one of those scenes makes it feel, like I said, very arbitrary for the chapter splits to exist the way they do. I think that basically every scene should have just been its own chapter, a la like Faithful and the Fallen, basically, where even in some of those books like Valor and in Wrath, where you're flipping a chapter every couple of pages, like I think that would not have necessarily been a bad thing for A Memory of Light, but it's such a minor thing. It's just the fact that the amount of POV and scene hopping is insane in this book, but it's also necessary. There are so many moving pieces, and so many of those pieces having to do with so many of the characters that we know, and those characters being in different places, that it's like it feels genuinely necessary. Even if the chapter delineation feels very arbitrary and kind of silly in some ways, the actual scene hopping itself is totally fitting. It works really, really well. All of the moving pieces being woven into place, pun intended, is really, really beautiful in A Memory of Light. And you know, it kind of makes me feel like the way that Towers of Midnight structured some of its POV allocation and stuff was like kind of anticipating this. You go from like, you know, Robert Jordan's style of having several chapters per POV, basically, all in a row. Then Gathering Storm basically flips you between a POV every chapter. Towers of Midnight starts flipping you between a couple of POVs every chapter. Then A Memory of Light is multiple POVs, like a handful in plenty of cases. And so like you feel like you're getting a little bit more chaotic in that way with the POV allocation. I still don't think that Towers of Midnight was necessarily served well by it, but A Memory of Light, it totally makes sense that a lot of these decisions were made because, yeah, there's a lot going on, and I just loved being able to follow it. I also loved being able to predict and know where some of the things went and where some things didn't, because of the way that things are structured. Just kind of inherently, you know where things are going, but then you're also surprised by other things, and then those things that surprise you is just like, okay, I now see where this is going, and then the other thing that you thought you knew about before manages to surprise you. There's so much going on, so many moving pieces, so many things being flipped around or being flipped between so often that like you're able to follow along just as much as you need to, but only as much as Sanderson wants you to, and it's great. It's really great. It's a really fun experience. I only really had a handful of very minor complaints about A Memory of Light, basically just being that the technological advancements associated with, you know, some of Rand's doing throughout the series, they just don't appear in the book, basically, and they don't make any difference at all in the series, even though they had, you know, a lot of promise that they were going to be used, and then they just weren't. Similarly, the ways also felt like they were going to be pretty important in this book, and they're like very much heavily implied that they're going to feature in the book, and then they just don't. We'll talk about that in just a second. And then one of the major antagonists, I think, is revealed in a pretty disappointing fashion, but really all of these things are done more or less out of necessity. The first one of those, the technological stuff, being because it's like it's just so much, and like you don't really spend enough time and like carrying for any of that to actually make enough difference. So not including it makes sense for time related reasons. And then the other two minor complaints that I just mentioned, also are made a little bit, they make a little bit more sense after the fact because of the bonus material. So what is my basic thoughts on the bonus material? Well, Ravens, the extra prologue to the Eye of the World, is a not undue look at the two rivers and some of its main characters from an alternate POV that I think is really fitting. Egwene being the POV of that prologue was a great idea, and revealing a little bit of the lore behind Shayol Ghul, the end of this Age of Legends, is a worthy ambition. But at the same time, I'm also not sure that that extra prologue is necessarily necessary for a first timer, especially alongside the prologue that already exists in that book. So having it be a bonus prologue to Raven or to Eye of the World just doesn't really sit well with me. I don't like that decision personally. I don't know that I would have necessarily liked for that extra prologue to be there. But that's basically just my personal opinion on that front. Pairing nicely, however, with Ravens is the Strike at Shayol Ghul, a little like it's an in-world lore document basically that explains little pieces about the end of the Age of Legends, about how the sealing of the Bore occurred, albeit from an academic perspective. Like there's a lot about that material that maybe could technically be read more or less any time throughout the series, but I think that the later the better is generally a good way to look at it, and I would recommend it either after The Gathering Storm or especially after A Memory of Light for general interest or for most impact, respectively. And the most impact basically being you get to see the end of the Third Age here, and comparing that to the end of the Second Age, the way that it is utilized and sort of told in both Ravens and the Strike at Shayol Ghul, ironically enough, makes for a very interesting, like, period to the end of the Wheel of Time. But that wasn't how I actually finished my journey with the series. How I finished my journey was with the cut content from A Memory of Light. Those were a sequence of scenes made into basically a short story called River of Souls, which is, in my opinion, a quite worthy and arguably necessary bit of content that doesn't fit in A Memory of Light. There's a particular character and plot line that I mentioned that is revealed in this book that I don't think is revealed in the most satisfying way, and it would have been better if the scenes that are River of Souls, which actually deal with actively foreshadowing that character, were in the book, but I understand why they were cut, because, well, it does throw off the pacing and the focus of A Memory of Light to do so. So it makes sense. It just would have been very fitting if the scenes had been included somewhere else, like in Towers of Midnight, for example. It would have been impossible to retroactively do that because the scenes weren't written until after that. So River of Souls, I would say read it before A Memory of Light because I think it is effective. The other bonus bit of cut content from A Memory of Light is A Fire Within the Waves, which I think is a particular piece that also makes sense to have been cut from the series, but nearly makes A Memory of Light worse in retrospect. I already talked about that I was a bit disappointed that the ways don't really appear in the book. After reading A Fire Within the Waves, I was even more disappointed with that. And there's also the fact that the things that come from A Fire Within the Ways that were repurposed in the final book because those scenes were no longer included in the book, they are better in A Fire Within the Ways than they are in the final book, unfortunately. But I also know and acknowledge that it would have taken a ton more work to make that bonus material actually fit in this book. It would have taken a lot more work for Fire Within the Ways to actually fit in A Memory of Light, but I almost think that it would have been worth it. But in the end, my reaction to the finale, this last trilogy, did Brandon Sanderson save the Wheel of Time, as my, question in like the thumbnail and or title of this video ask? My controversial hot take is yes. I think that Brandon Sanderson saved the Wheel of Time. Because my controversial hot take, and this is a hot take that I put in the last diary for A Memory of Light, making it the first video of mine on this channel to get any dislikes in a couple of months, actually. So, feels weird, man. But that hot take is that I do not believe that Robert Jordan would have been able to pull off the ending to the series for a handful of reasons. My general feeling about this last act of the series is the context in which it exists under Sanderson's tenure versus how it hypothetically probably would have existed under Robert Jordan's foresight or oversight, whatever you want to call it. Robert Jordan, unfortunately, had very little to no restraint by the end of his life and the end of his writing. I hate to disrespect the dead, but it is absolutely true that he did not have very much editing going on in his books, or if he did, he very much painstakingly refused to use any of it, and he already felt very little need to rein in his prose or focus on plot, kind of leading up to the end anyway. So the fact that he was planning to write this final act of the series as one large book that would have required a cart to wheel it in very much implies that he would not have had any restraint at all for the final book, and that would have led to disaster because there would have been nothing stopping him from making the book long enough to have to be split into 5 volumes by the end. And as I discussed in the last one of these roundup videos, books 7 through 11 is a solid trilogy that are 5 books because Robert Jordan did not show any restraint and because he lost focus, and I think he would not have shown restraint and would not have had enough focus in order to make this last act of the series a comparable trilogy or anything even remotely resembling that. In comparison, Sanderson, on the other hand, had nothing but constant restraint imposed on him, and this final act of the series turned out the way it did because there was a ton of editorial work going into his entries, inherently and indisputably, for obvious reasons. Not only could he not waste prose the way that Robert Jordan would have, I think that Brandon Sanderson's natural prose is already inherently more efficient. I definitely read Sanderson's prose a lot quicker than I read Robert Jordan's prose. For, any evidence of this, we can just compare how long it took me to read the first trilogy of the series compared to the second trilogy of the series. This is going to take me a little bit of time to do the math, but let's just pull out a quick little calculator and add approximately 306,000 words and 267,000 words and 251,000 words for the first 3 books, being 824,000 words total, divided by 86 hours that it took me to read them. That is approximately 9,500 words, 9,600 words an hour. Okay, so let's just write that down real quick. 9,600 words an hour. Compare that to the last 3 books, which are 297.5 thousand. My thing did not work. Are you going to type my numbers, please? 297,500 plus 327,000 plus 354,000 words for the last 3 books, divided by the 91.5 hours it took me to read that, and you have 10,500, nearly 11,000 words an hour. That's over 1,000 words an hour more under Sanderson's prose than under Robert Jordan's prose. And if we do a little bit of extra math, 1,000 words an hour divided by the 60 minutes, it's 17 words per minute faster for Brandon Sanderson. I am not a fast reader. My average reading speed is somewhere in the ballpark of 175 words a minute. So for Sanderson's prose to be 17 words faster than Robert Jordan's for me is no small thing to note. It is a lot. I would guess that Robert Jordan's, I guess I could just straight up do the calculations now, but I don't feel like it's necessarily worth it. But let's give it a shot. Knife of Dreams was 315,000. Let's divide that by how many hours it took me to read it, which was 33.5. That was about 9,400 words an hour. That's on the lower end of my reading speed for Robert Jordan. And the later books in the series were when I really started to slow down with his writing, by the way. Like, that example that I gave from the first 3 books was quicker than the slog was, for sure. So 9,400 words in an hour is 156 words a minute. That's like 20 minutes slower than my average. Compare that to A Memory of a Light, which I read very quickly, even for me, and we get 340,000 words divided by 31.5 hours, and you get 11,200 words an hour divided by 60 minutes is 186 words a minute. That's 10 words faster than my average. So Robert Jordan, 20 words slower than my average by the end. Brandon Sanderson, 10 words faster than my average. So, there are so many different factors that go into reading speed that it's not worth making like a huge long argument about this. It is merely the fact that for me, Sanderson's prose is more efficient than Robert Jordan's, and the fact that his prose is more efficient and he was not allowed to waste any space with inefficient prose like Jordan would have, meant that he was inherently in a better position to actually do all of this. If Robert Jordan were to do the exact same scenes in here and all of it were to work out the exact same way for all intents and purposes, it would still probably be 4 books instead of 3, solely on account of prose, if not worse than that. So that's just something that has to be acknowledged. There are some structural issues that appear in the final trilogy, some certain decisions that I disagree with in that front, but regardless of that, what it comes down to is that this final act of the series basically needed to be thought of as multiple volumes in conception. The only reason that the structural issues really occur, or the primary reason that the structural issues that do occur, is because of the fact that Gathering Storm and Towers of Midnight were closer to 1 volume and were then split later, and you can feel that. If something like that were to have happened with Robert Jordan, he were to write the entire thing as 1 volume and then it be split into multiple parts afterwards, I just don't see that working out at all. Like, it just probably wouldn't be great. But regardless of any of that aspect, I'm happy to say that this journey was actually worth it for me. There are some reservations that I have with regards to recommending it, things that I've talked about various different times in the past and in many, many different videos about the Wheel of Time. And I will talk about that a little bit more directly forefront in an entire series context and a full series review and recommendation that I will make at some point in May. But the journey was worth it for me. I would also say that I would never reread this series except to potentially fan edit the problems that I have with it, but that is like such an impossibility and such a long shot that it's hardly even worth like seriously considering, right? Like, why would somebody do that? Just risk a cease and desist, right? But the point is, I have a lot of reservations about recommending the series, and I would never reread the series myself unironically just to read it again, but I'm not mad that I did read it. A bucket list item that I've had for many years has been crossed off. From the very moment that I started BookTube, a lot of what I was wanting to do on BookTube was to do this, basically. And now after 3 years, 4.5 years of doing BookTube almost, and now over 3 years since I started the series, it's done. Which means that this is it. That's it. That's the last Wheel of Time diary. It's been a long journey, it's really weird to say that. The last Wheel of Time diary. 75 videos, 3 years since I did the first one, almost to the day, actually, because this video comes out on May 7th of 2026. When did the very first Wheel of Time diary come out? Let us look in my YouTube studio and look up Wheel of Time Diaries, episode 1. Thursday, May 4th, 2023. Today is Thursday, May 7th, 2026. So basically exactly 3 years since I did the first diary. After 75 of these, I am now done. It is a very weird feeling not having any more of these on the docket. It's a very weird feeling not having this series on the docket. You know so much about my TBR month to month, and especially every couple of months for the last 3 years has been based on whether I was reading a Wheel of Time book that month or not. And if I was, then the rest of my reads were going to be a little bit shorter, a little bit quicker, more reserved to some degree, generally speaking. And then the months that I wasn't reading a Wheel of Time book, I could be a little bit more free with what I was planning to read, because I wouldn't have one of these behemoths like taking over the vast majority of my reading time that month. And so now my schedule being freed up a bit, and especially through the rest of 2026, is like, it's a godsend. It is, but it's also like really, really strange. But I also anticipate that it'll get to be a little bit too weird, so maybe I start the Cosmere Diaries in 2027, huh? I like that idea. Does that sound like a plan? I think that might sound like a plan. We'll see a little bit later in 2026. I'll probably make some form of video talking about what I plan to do with the Cosmere, because I planned to not read any of the Cosmere or any of Sanderson's stuff until after I had finished the Wheel of Time. I have done that, so now it's time to read Sando properly, I guess. So, yeah. That's the end of the final Wheel of Time diary. Thank you to everybody who ever watched this series over the last 3 years, and thank you to everybody who continues to moving into the future. It's definitely been a journey. But all that being said, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC. This has been the last Wheel of Time diary, and I hope to see you guys in the next video, and especially the rest of the Wheel of Time content I have coming out this month, because this isn't the last Wheel of Time video, it's just the last diary. So maybe I'll see you guys next time.